roofs out, you can burn wooden bridges down, you can burn crops, you can burn all of this stuff to basically force the army to fight only when and where you want to fight, which Sun Tzu even says, the person that picks the ground is the person that's going to win the battle. And if you can force them to...
I was going to say, you could take out the other people's scouts, the opposite. You could take out the opposition scouts as well.
Oh yeah, you can do that for either delaying your enemy, or even just forcing them. If you start burning their lands, they're going to have to raise an army to respond to you. So if you can do that, you can move your army to where you're going to go first. And then you pick the terrain, you can usually probably pick the high ground. Your troops are going to be very well rested. I mean, there's a lot in ancient and medieval warfare. The side that is able to force the enemy to come to them and have to fight when they're tired while their troops have been able to sleep in and have a big breakfast, that has actually been one of the big things that have changed battles. Hannibal, the famous general and famous enemy of Rome, one of the things that he was able to do was force the Romans to come to him, and they have to fight when they were tired, hungry, cold. I mean, the battle at the River Trebia, they even show in the Analects, these Roman legionnaires had to wade through a freezing river, and then you have to get up, form into a line, and then attack the enemy when you're just soaked to the bone in freezing cold water. I mean, it's just terrible. And with a dragon, you could actually do that. You could actually force them to maybe say, have to cross a river because you've burned out the bridge. So now they have to ford it, and a ford, it makes it very slow for them to move. Then you can attack them when they're on bad ground and probably just win the battle without even using the dragon if you don't even need to. Speaking of fire attacks, in medieval warfare, fire attacks were very difficult to do. You have to transport a large amount of combustible material, which is very heavy and very difficult to move. You have to require usually a team of several oxen and wagons, which is very slow going. A dragon really changes all of that because all you really need is the actual dragon itself. Certainly having a stack of tinder and wood would help in terms of setting something on fire, but you would actually just use the fire breath to actually start the fire because the dragon can continue to breathe it. We don't actually have any documented thing of how long they can actually breathe the fire, but chances are really good. It's probably some sort of gaseous reaction from a gland in their physiology, so they can actually breathe it probably for a sustained period of time. So you don't actually really need to have a large stack of combustible materials to set it alight or specialized crew to service them, because the dragon will just keep breathing fire until whatever it is that's in front of it will burn. I mean, the dragon breathes fire hot enough to melt stone and steel. Any sort of organic combustible material it's not going to stand a chance with a sustained bout of fire unless the weather doesn't permit. But I mean, if everyone's ever had to try and build a fire with wet green wood, it's just horrifying. But then when you actually get to the battle itself, the best use for a dragon would be close air support. Close air support is a modern invention. It's when you use aircraft to support your ground forces. It was designed in World War I, really came into its own in World War II. And then with the advent of helicopters in Vietnam, that was where close air support really got to where it's going. Now we've got Predator drones, Reaper drones, and things like that. So close air support is very useful. Modern commanders say that if I have the air, then I will win, because they're able to bring out a large amount of firepower against an enemy position. That unless they're entrenched, they're not going to be able to defend against high explosive munitions from the air. And if they are entrenched, then they aren't able to move out of it. So then you can attack positions and force them to move out of it, and then hit them with your close air support. With the nice thing about a dragon, as opposed to say an Apache helicopter being targeted by an RPG-7 or something like that, as what happened in the Mujahideen campaign in Afghanistan versus the Soviets. The dragons are very well armored, and against the actual weapons that medieval warfare can actually bring to battle, there's not a whole lot that'll actually bring down a big Valyrian or a Vagar in the Dance of the Dragons size dragon. The dragon's scales thicken as they age. They get a little bit clumsier when they get older, but become much more defensive. You can even see that when Visenya was attacking in the field of fire, she rode the smallest dragon, and the dragon was completely uninjured in the field of fire. She herself took an arrow, so the actual arrows of normal just hand bows just really bounce off the scales of a dragon. So you would have to get really lucky and hit in a critical point, like the eye or something like that, some soft tissue, to actually even hurt a dragon with conventional hand weapon. So that's actually makes it, you can actually be a lot more aggressive with a dragon than you could be with perhaps, let's just say if you were to bring some sort of maybe Aegon style wildfire dragon, those little silly siege engines he had that burned down half the Kingswood. Those things are incredibly volatile, whereas a dragon is actually relatively stable. So when you can actually see this in the War of the Five Kings, where Gregor the Clegane launches what is called a chevauchée against the Riverlanders. Basically, he attacking the peasantry, burning the crops and stuff like that. That was common in the Middle Ages. Edward the Black Prince did a very famous one in France. The idea was that you could attack an enemy and force them to do battle with you. As we said, a dragon solves the problem of actually needing to get men, torches, and horses to go and launch your chevauchée, because the dragon is just all of that in one. So you can actually launch a one-man chevauchée with a dragon. And so if you want to force someone to fight you, or alternatively cause enough domestic unrest that they now have to suppress their own peasantry, or even so, like with the hordes overlords just were suppressing the Riverlanders for a while, and then the Edmund Tully said enough is enough, gets all of the Riverlanders together, squares field to Aegon, and now he has his own army with local knowledge and enough manpower to actually do anything. Aegon still only had 3 dragons, so he had to use them tactically. But if he had the support of the local population, he was actually able to hold the Riverlands, and very successfully, even though the Riverlands themselves were relatively unstable, because they're the center of Westeros, so they pretty much take it on the chin whenever there's a civil war. The Riverlanders themselves, they tend to support, whoever they support tends to benefit from having the local knowledge of the Riverlanders. And Robb Stark, when he got the Riverlanders on his side, he was able to use their local knowledge. Mark Piper was able to bushwhack the Lannister forces with 50 men. Just when you talk about asymmetric warfare, 50 men against Jaime's army of 20,000, and he was still able to frustrate him enough to bait him into the Battle of the Camps. So finally, the other thing that dragon can be used is for siege warfare. Harrenhal is the classic example. If you apply enough dragon fire, even the mightiest keeps will burn, and turn Harrenhal, the greatest keep, into just molten slag full of ghosts. Which, now it's prime real estate if you're brave enough. But so the dragon can burn fortifications and force men off the battlements. That's one of the big things. If it can force men off the battlements, then you can actually bring ladders or rams to a gate. You could theoretically use a dragon to burn scaffolding and do sapping operations. That's when you dig a tunnel under a fortification, and then you line it with wooden scaffolding, and then you burn the scaffolding, or in an era of gunpowder, you light keg of gunpowder. It collapses the tunnel, it collapses the foundation the wall is built on, and brings the wall down. That was one of the more famous, especially when stone walls became a big thing in the more later Middle Ages, as opposed to keeps of wood, earth, and clay. You really needed to use these anti-stone fortifications, because mangonels and trebuchets, they were effective, but not as effective as these specialized, intensive tunnel operations. And a dragon could theoretically just burn the scaffolding from the inside out. Although I will say that dragons probably aren't as useful for anti-cave warfare, because this goes back to the idea that flamethrowers in World War II, that's what you use to clear out bunkers. But one of the reasons why they were able to actually clear out bunkers is because they used a liquid fuel, basically jelly gasoline, and that deoxygenated air very quickly. A gaseous fire, which is what I believe that the dragons use to actually light their fire, that won't penetrate very far into the cave and won't deoxygenate the air in the back of the cave. So unless you're actually able to stand there for a long period of time, you probably can't burn them out. And if it's an established cave system with secure venting, you probably won't be able to take out a cave that way with simply a dragon. You would actually have to go and developed liquid fuels that were common to the flamethrowers of the Second World War. So, now that I've told you all about how scary dragons are, let's talk about how to defeat them, because you may not actually have a dragon, and statistically speaking, in Westeros, you're probably not likely to have one, but you're probably going to have to either fight alongside or against one, so it might be worthwhile to know how to defeat them. The largest defeat that dragons ever suffered was the storming of the dragon pit. 4 dragons died in relatively quick succession against basically peasants armed with little more than knives, sharpened farm equipment, nothing really in terms of maybe some scavenged weapons here and there. They were able to take out the dragons because their mobility was constrained. They were stuck in what's the dragon pit, which was a covered stable, and the dragons themselves were chained down. So if you wanted to actually take out a dragon, constraining its mobility is the best way to do that. So either attacking it while it's in its stable, perhaps even bringing the stable down. That was what apparently killed Dreamfire, Helena Targaryen's dragon. She tried to break out, she hit the ceiling of the dragon pit, and the rocks collapsed in on her. And that's probably, it doesn't matter how big of a dragon you are, you're not going to survive a building falling on you. That actually brings me to a good point. Blunt force trauma, when you're hitting a flying enemy, is one of the more effective ways to attack, because when you attack with blunt force against an enemy in the air, there's nothing for them to brace against. When you're dealing with receiving blunt force trauma, one of the best ways, besides not getting hit at all, is to actually brace yourself against the ground so that you can absorb the impact, and the impact can transmit through you into the ground. You still don't want to get hit in the head or anything like that, but because a dragon is airborne, there's nothing for it to brace onto. That's one of the big reasons why you wouldn't be fighting with a lance on dragonback, because an aerial impact with another dragon would actually cause both of you to fall out of the sky, and that's just no good for anyone, especially, as I'll say in a little bit, when there's other things you can do when you're on dragonback against the same infantry army. Rhaenys, the sister of Aegon the First, was taken out in Hellholt with a scorpion bolt. Scorpions were a Roman siege engine. The siege engine looked basically kind of like an oversized crossbow. And they're used very commonly in Westeros. Edmure Tully uses scorpions in the Battle of the Fords against Tywin Lannister, and he's able to win 11,000 to 20,000 because of effective use of terrain and the use of siege engines. So if you can secure your siege engines on a good, solid fighting fortification and force the dragon to come to you, then you can fire at the dragon. But again, if it's a big dragon, you're going to need to get a little lucky and try and hit it in soft tissue. One of the better ideas might actually just be to attack the dragon rider when the dragon is not on the dragon. Taming a dragon is very difficult. I mean, if you've read the Blacks and the Greens, how many people died when they were trying to tame the 3 wild dragons that were on Dragonstone? So if you can take out a dragon rider who is bonded to a dragon, then they can't use the dragon in battle against you. And it's going to take them time to find a dragon rider who can actually tame the dragon. Then they're going to need to learn how to fly it, how to control it in that sense. So if you can remove the dragon riders from the equation, then they have a bunch of big, scary fire beasts they can do absolutely nothing with. And so that's one of the better ways. And of course, a man is a lot easier to take down than a dragon. You can send assassins, you can poison them. Well, you might actually even be able to poison a dragon if you believe in Maester conspiracy. The Maester conspiracy being that the Maesters conspired to poison the dragons and render them extinct. It may be, you might be able to find a poison potent enough to take down a dragon. Given how heavy they are, you would probably need a lot of poison. But if you have access to their feeding troughs or whatever, you give them poisoned pigs or something like that, they might be able to. Well, if you have an ingestible poison, you've seen Drogon in Daenerys' chapters. He goes through so much food a day, it's not even funny. If you actually have access to his food source, you might be able to poison some of the pigs and drop them in these feeding troughs or wherever it is that Drogon goes to get his food until he gets out, just eats whatever he wants. So that might be a more effective way. If you are on a dragon though, and you want to actually go and fight a fortification, or not fortification, if you want to fight a man of arm, body of troops, I wouldn't recommend actually trying to do pass-bys, because they might be able to fire arrows up, and just like Visenya took arrows when she was using her dragon at the field of fire. That would expose yourself to harm. There's actually a weapon, a World War I weapon, not a World War II weapon called a flechette. It's basically a weighted, sharpened iron spike, and you could drop it out of a plane. And you could actually do the same thing with medieval warfare with a dragon. You can just fly up as high as you want and just drop sharpened iron spikes on you. At that height, you wouldn't be able to hit a single person. But if you drop them on a fortification of troops, what you would do is essentially you would loosen up their fortification, and then you could charge in with your heavy cavalry in a flying wedge and split the formation apart, and then roll up the line if you want. And that'd be a good way to integrate your dragon into a cavalry component, basically breaking down the fortifications that enemy has and getting them to rout. In medieval warfare, typically all of the casualties happened during the pursuit phase, when one side was no longer engaged in battle and was actively fleeing. That was when they would deploy the cavalry, and the cavalry would run down the enemies. And I mean, if you've ever heard, you've seen Septon Marigold's speech, it's horrifying when you see men on horseback running you down. People will break even before that even happens, because they don't want to be the ones in the back who are going to be the ones cut down by these knights in shining armor, gallantly cutting down fleeing peasants in the back. Anybody have any questions? I'm about halfway through. So,
I actually have a question on the scorpion.
Scorpions, yes.
Just in the real medieval times, what were they good for? I picture it's one big giant crossbow bow, but what would you actually use that for effectively?
Well, you can use them to shoot at fortifications. You could use them to shoot at large bodies of men, again, to break them up. And it provided a large amount of fighting power, especially with heavy infantry in formation. You want a large hitting force to loosen up their formation. Horses don't like to charge into large bodies of packed men. In the Middle Ages, they often said, we'll go and charge that pike square and we'll ride it into a red ruin. But usually the horses would actually stop if the pike square stayed together, which is why most of the time these knights would do mock charges to try and get the pike square, some of the people in the square to flee and break up the formation. So you could use a scorpion for much the same purpose. And then just like with an arbalest, you can actually fire it at a fortification to clear the walls. If you're doing if you're doing the lantern or ladder raising operation, you want to clear a section of walls to raise a fortification. Or, they're also actually good, I believe it was in the Crusades, they used a scorpion bolt to signal a tower guard that they flipped to open the gates and let them in. So, just in terms of, any way they could. Gentlemen with the amazing beard.
When you consider how many medieval battles ended up being just troop movements and spending half the day redeploying and moving around, wouldn't the dragon actually be amazing? It's just a tactical advantage for seeing the battlefield and scouting forward.
Did you miss the beginning of this?
I did.
I talked about reconnaissance for solid 5 minutes. But no, it's okay. No, it's like I said, it's important. The fact that there are no real anti-air weapons until essentially the advent of the Vickers gun and the flak cannon, which were 20th century. Well, the Vickers gun was in late 19th century, but close enough. There's nothing really that could. If a dragon's flying around, it's like, well, you can't hide from this. Essentially, unless you're in a cave or in a deep forest, you can't hide from aerial reconnaissance. So, the ability for a dragon rider to actually to size up the battlefield and report back to a ground commander about where the troops are is invaluable. If you could just find out where they are, if they're out of formation, all right, we'll have a force march and we'll hit them when they're on bad ground. If they're on good ground, we'll say, okay, well, we'll avoid that. We'll see if maybe attack this objective over here and force them off their high
So
ground.
valuable, you would never want to use them this way.
If your dragon is amenable to having passengers, because let's not forget, the dragons are sentient, but they're not sapient.
Yeah.
And they might have their own opinions on whether or not they can carry passengers. I know Ronald Aaron was able to fly, but he was like a 6 or 7 year old kid, so he doesn't really count as opposed to having another fully grown adult on his back. But if it does, you could actually bring a scout with a mirrorish lens. The dragon rider could actually go and ride, and the scout could actually just pick out all the points. You could try to sketch the enemy fortifications if you want, but you're above the gust line at that point. So the trees will break up. If you actually were to just jump very high into the air, you would notice the wind starts to get much heavier when you get away from the ground, because there's fortifications, mountains, trees, and all that stuff breaks up the gusts. Whereas a little bit higher in the atmosphere, the winds are much heavier. So that might actually cause your sketch pad to just be blown away and worthless. But just having a person up there, and if you have 2 eyes, your dragon rider can also count as well, and make sure you have a more accurate count when you're doing your reconnaissance. Because there have been countless numbers of battles that have been lost on bad information, even something as simple as counting the wrong number of troops. And they go and they charge into a place that they think is weak, but it turns out has 3 times the men that they thought they did. So now, if you were actually going to go and engage another dragon rider with your dragon rider, well, you could do it the Daemon Targaryen way, which is incredibly boss, but very difficult. You're looking at 2 3-dimensional axes of combat, trying to jump from one target to another. That's incredibly difficult, and realistically, what would have happened is he would have completely missed and fallen to his death, but that doesn't really make a good story, as opposed to landing on his back and then driving your sword into his eye, his fake eye, in a cool mutual kill. It was phenomenal scene. Unlikely, but that's why it's a fantasy story. We can have that. I would actually use the dragons. If you have the lighter dragon, you have more mobility. You can kind of see in that actual duel, Aemon One Eye couldn't ascend as fast because his dragon was much bigger and slower. So as the dragons get older, they probably need to devote more forward movement to actually just going forward. So they can't ascend the way helicopters can. It'd be more of a fixed wing aircraft. Even a big one like Valyrian, probably by the end of it, is basically a flying fridge. But that's just the way it is. When things are large, they require a lot of forward momentum in order to stay airborne to generate the lift that they need. Even the large muscles on the dragon's back wouldn't be able to generate enough lift to lift its bulk up. That's the square cube law. Square cube law, for those who don't know physics or have listened to a bunch of angry nerds say why we can't have giant mecha in real life, is that power increases at a cross-section of area, so an exponent of 2, whereas mass increases at an exponent of 3. So that means the larger you make something, it will eventually not be able to generate enough power to support its own body weight. And that was why a lot of these large dinosaurs had to spend most of their time in water, where the extra buoyancy of the water would help support their bodies. So again, dragons are really cool. They don't make a lot of sense, but that's why this is a physics, or that's why this is a fantasy, not a physics. It's a physics story. You probably have, well, actually, a lot of you guys are nerdy enough that you enjoy a good physics story. That's for yourselves. But I would use dragons. You could use the fire breath, especially if you're a smaller dragon. You would ascend quickly, try to get into some cloud cover, and then come behind on the dragon, your enemy 6, and then use the fire breath against the actual rider themselves to either force their dragon out of control, or if you again are a lighter dragon, you could use a compound bow.
So I was just thinking, because fire isn't a projectile that's coming out, would the fire just literally come back into your face?
See, it's a good question, because we've seen the dragons use fire on the wing in the book series. So I don't really know, because that's one thing I was wondering about, and I eventually just went to the knowledge of, well, they were using the fire breath on the wing in the books, so it must be. But I could see having to go completely above them and trying to breathe down, as opposed to breathing
forward.
So as opposed to being on their 6, you would be kind of at their 6, but you would also be at about their 1 or 2 o'clock on the z-axis.
More like a dive bomber in the Second World War.
Yeah, exactly, like a dive bomber in the Second World War. And that's what you would use against ground targets. You would dive down, because you would be able to streamline your frame to make you much harder to hit, and you'd be going at a faster velocity, which less likely that someone would be able to hit you with an arrow or a javelin, and then you would just kind of breathe downwards. And whether you want to do that as just a straight attack, or you can do it as an area denial move, that's what Visenya and Rhaenys did in the Field of Fire. They burned all that wheat that was around them and corralled the army of the two kings to be close together, so that eventually when they were able to actually go from an area denial move to attack pattern, the casualties were immense. I think they said it was over half of the people at the Field of Fire, which was 55,000, were wounded. I mean, a casualty ratio of over 50% for killed and wounded in any battle is amazing. That's exceptional. And to be able to do that to such a large army really was able to kind of, you can see why Torrhen Stark was saying, no, maybe we shouldn't fight them if they can inflict that level of casualties. So I could see you using a dive bomb. If you're a bigger target, what you really want to be able to do is you really want to be able to hit your enemy while they're either landing or trying to take off. You want to be able to constrain that mobility and use your greater mass to just kind of force them down. They might be able to get up, but even then, they're still going to require forward momentum. If you can get yourself far back enough, and again, use cloud cover, tactically speaking, cloud cover was one of the best ways that World War II and World War I dogfighters would use to hide themselves. You could go and hide, keeping the sun to your back. If you were able to do that and impair your enemy's visibility, that would be a great way to do that. But if you can get on a straight beat with your larger dragon to attack the smaller dragon, you can force them essentially out of control. As we see with the smaller dragons, they aren't very good when they have a lot of difficulties with weather or other constraints. Aegon the III flew his dragon, which was very small, and it almost drowned trying to save him from the battle in the Gullet. And then, actually, I think it did drown.
No, it got him back to.
They got him back, and then he died of exhaustion.
Yeah.
That's right. So you can see. So if you were able to overstrain these younger dragons, that would be a way. Then they can't use that exceptional mobility because the dragon is simply too tired. So that would be the way to defeat an opponent that has a smaller dragon. Then if you don't want to do the whole jumping off the back, if you can perform the trajectory in your head well enough, more power to you. But I'm going to stick with something that's a little bit higher chance of success because, well, frankly, if the story of my life is going to be, and then he jumped off his dragon and plummeted to his death like an idiot, well, that's kind of a bad story, at least from my perspective.
I have a question.
Sir.
What about fear? Do dragons ever have fear?
So I don't think they have fear in the same way of the Dungeons and Dragons supernatural fear aura, but they do. Dragons in 3.5 had a supernatural fear aura. But I could see using, that is a very strong thing, especially when you have less than professional troops. In the medieval era, the model that Martin uses is a lot more levy focused than was traditional in actual medieval history, but that's really his kind of opinions on Vietnam and drafty GIs in Vietnam, and that's kind of you have to accept the context that he's looking at. But using fear is incredibly effective for breaking up formations. It's called shock. You can use the actual sheer just the fear of it. Like as I was saying with the horses that did mock charges to break up pike squares, a dragon would be much worse because fire is much harder to defend against than a charging cavalryman. While a charging cavalryman is not great, you can brace a polearm against the ground to try and defend yourself. And you've got a lot of polearms in sequence. The pike squares, that was one reason why the pike square was so effective, but it required you to train because if you didn't know what you were doing, you got tangled up, and it was just terrible. But how can you defend against a fire? The only really way to defend against fire is to use something that can smother it or move away. And if you move away, then you have to move out of formation. So yes, using a dragon to break up a formation through its sheer presence and fear, just to cause people to rout, is incredibly effective. And then when they're in that pursuit, you can burn them at your leisure. They're not fighting back.
But what about the dragon itself? Does it dragon ever get scared? Does a smaller
So-
dragon have fear from a larger dragon? I don't ever remember reading anything about it, but I'm curious.
But I do know that a dragon is sentient, so I would assume that it has the capacity for self-preservation enough. So I mean, again, the dragons aren't sapient, so they don't feel fear the same way we do. They're not going to stress out after for a big presentation at the office. But we can make ourselves scared through a lot of ways. But I do believe that the self-preservation instinct is present within a dragon, and the training of a dragon rider may be able to override it just the way. I mean, horses are actually prey animals. But if you train a horse as a war horse, you can overcome a lot of the fear and anxiety it has. And really, one of the best ways to get that is to actually use a novel sensation where the training can't work. That was why I believe it was Xenophon said that horses that weren't used to the smell of camels were spooked in their presence, whereas the local Palestinian horse trainers would often corral camels and horses together. Their camels were the horses were perfectly fine with the smell because they were used to it. But a prey animal is often afraid. Now, by new sensation, a dragon is actually probably more akin to a predator animal. So, but even predators have self-preservation. I mean, if you've seen, lion males duking it out and stuff like that, you know that they very clearly have self-preservation instincts. So yeah, I would say that a dragon can feel fear, especially a smaller dragon with a larger dragon. And it's a matter of the training of the actual individual mount themselves and the training in the head of the dragon rider. I think a skilled dragon rider might be able to corral and overcome that fear, and a less skilled dragon rider, maybe an amateur or someone who doesn't quite know what they're doing, they'll panic and they'll send their small dragon into a panic route. They may hit a terrain feature. They may just fly into a trap or something like that. But yeah, no, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I can't give you a good answer because we don't have any dragon POV chapters. But yeah.
Daenerys compares the horses and dragons. Of when you pull one way, the horse goes opposite.
Yep.
The dragon goes towards.
Flight versus fight mechanic, isn't it? Turns towards the
Gentlemen,
The one thing that bugs me when it comes to combating dragons is like the underuse and misuse of something like scorpion. Like it's an error.
yes.
Why not attach chains to it?
Oh, no, change would actually be a very effective way. This is more past that the Age of Discovery. They used what's called chain shot.
Right.
The chain shot was useful for taking down sails. I could actually see chain shot being used to kind of rip apart a dragon's wing. That would be one of the more effective ways of fighting a dragon, is if you were able to cause tearing trauma, lacerations to the wing, and that really mess up that flight service. It would ground the dragon, if not just, I mean, at least if I understand the descriptions of them correctly, the wings are more membranous, which means that they would actually have small blood vessels, which means that they would actually be very painful for a dragon. It's kind of like ripping your ear.
And just the accuracy is not as much of an issue then.
That's
we
true.
can't shoot down planes. We have flak because like we can't even shoot down
Yeah,
planes.
that's the issue though, is that when you're aiming with a three-dimensional axis, it's a lot harder than when you're on a battlefield with a scorpion. You're only fighting.
Oh, we can't judge distance.
Yeah, no. Height is, and we're terrible. We are terrible at judging height from a human perspective. The problem is you could probably do that if the dragon was attacking a fortification, where you could force the dragon into close range. So in that suggestion, if you were using chain shot or chain arrow in such a case, I would actually mount I would do like a ballista tower, which was common in the high Middle Ages, going into the late Middle Ages. These defensive ballista towers until you get a cannon. When you get a cannon, you might be actually in really good shape, because then you can use canister shot if you really wanted to. Canister shot would be terrifying against a dragon, or against a dragon rider. Turn you apart. If you guys don't know what canister shot is, canister shot was in the Napoleonic U.S. Civil War time. It was basically a tomato can full of BBs. It was essentially turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. You could load double canister and fire at a charging formation, and you would obliterate maybe 60, 70 people in one shot. It's horrifying.
Against his own citizens.
Yeah, or get
Yeah, it's drunk.
We'll talk. We can talk about that one offline. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this panel. But yes, so yeah, but counter dragon warfare. I would say if you can force them into a position, or if they're grounded. Weather. If the weather is too extreme, at the last storm, Meraxes was grounded because of the heavy weather. The problem is, of course, you can't depend on the weather. There's a saying in the military which is if you count on the weather, you can count to fail. Basically. Unless you're in the stormlands, in which case it always seems to thunderstorm at dramatically appropriate moments. And I can't really think of a more dramatically appropriate moment than fighting a dragon. Let's see how much time we got. We've got 10 minutes left, so let's have some more questions. If there's anybody got any more questions.
Just
Turn them back with glasses.
Back on the dragon fear thing for a second.
Okay.
If I remember right, when I forget which of Rhaenyra's kids goes to Storm's End, but Aemond and Vhagar are already there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it says that he has to force his dragon down because the dragon's afraid of Vhagar. That's the implication.
I could see that, especially since I wouldn't be surprised because Vhagar might have even sired or laid the eggs of those dragons. I mean, I would have to look at really the dragon family dynamics. That's actually an interesting thing. So dragons, as it turns out, you can actually build a viable population of dragons with only 3. Because Aegon did it, and in the golden age of Jaehaerys, they had 12, 14 dragons, and none of them seemed to exhibit any of the genetic defects of the later dragons, like the tiny ones that were like the skull the size of an apple, like the sickly green female. So Daenerys could actually bring back, with her 3 dragons, could bring back the dragons to a viable breeding population until the next Targaryen civil war kills all of them. But so I don't know what the dragon family dynamics are, but that actually does make me think of something. I don't think actually you can breed traits in dragons because of their long lives, but I don't know what the egg-laying period of a dragon is. Like when it comes to domestication of animals, the reason why we're able to do that with things like sheep and cows and stuff like that is because we're able to go through multiple generations of the beast's life with one person, and then you can kind of pass that down. And that's why we were able to genetically breed the fluffiest sheep and the biggest horses. I mean, if you look at the descriptions of horses back in the old ancient Egyptian times, they're not big enough to carry a man. They had to use them in teams of 2 to carry a chariot. But then later on, we were able to build or breed horses to be larger to the point that then we get the companion cavalry and all of the cool things that you can do with actual mounted troops. But so you might be able to do that depending on how quick the breeding cycle of the egg cycle of a dragon is. And unfortunately, we don't actually get a real sense of how long it is. There might be a question to pester George about if we ever get to corner him at a convention somewhere. Because while the dragons themselves far outlive humans, I mean, Valyrian came from the Targaryen migration and lived until the era of Viserys the First. So a dragon can outlive a human, but if the egg cycle is relatively quick, you might be able to breed dragons. And I can actually see the ancient Valyrians doing that, breeding dragons that are larger, stronger, fiercer, brighter, on hotter fires, even showy dragons with big, magnificent crests, if that was considered aesthetic. I mean, look at all the silly things we've done with dogs. We've bred aesthetically pleasing dogs. But I mean, if that's what you want, if humans have the intelligence to do that, and if the egg cycle is quick enough, you can do that with dragons as well. Anybody else have anything?
Okay. So I guess we'll get this answer on Sunday probably. But
No,
do you think that Rhaegal and Drogon will show fear against undead Viserion?
So that's a good question. First off, I'm just gonna, as a caveat, I don't watch the show. I do know this. I do know that event happened, so I'm gonna try to answer the question as best I can. But if there is like something in the show that might help answer this question better, unfortunately, I probably don't know it. No, I just figured it's fair to get the caveat out of the way first. I think that would be whether or not they actually show fear against the others themselves, because I think there's actually a sort of we do know that whites exhibit some level of autonomy and intelligence. We know that because the whites that went into the wall were able to specifically target key officers as opposed to just going on mindless rampages. So we do know that the whites themselves are intelligent. Now the question is do these supernatural elements of fire and ice together, do they cause a serious, anger effect? Or does this? We know that these whites probably spook animals, although except for Ghost, because Ghost was actually was good about it. So I could see that. I don't think that just by being undead, but it is possible that the others might have some sort of magical mojo behind them that could inspire fear.
They're
But
ghosts and dragons of fire.
well, I mean, more than there's ice dragons.
I wonder if the
Theoretically, there are ice dragons. George keeps telling us that there are ice dragons,
Yeah.
but
Viserion ice fire might harm the remaining 2 dragons.
now that is also true, and especially, there's obviously magic involved with that. So because undead thing can't breathe, but I could definitely see that that sort of thing just in terms. They basically be supernatural fire versus supernatural ice, or matter and antimatter type thing. So you might see some pyrotechnics if their CGI budget's high enough.
It's
Yeah.
hot.
That's what I mean.
Gentlemen, back.
What, we don't see ghosts?
Just
Yes.
one quick point. Viserion in the show is actually an other. He's not a white. They clarified that, and it's in the script.
Oh, okay.
You'll notice his eyes. You don't watch the show.
Yeah, so-
But
so
they-
I mean-
so as far as him, I guess he's not technically undead. He's back from the dead or whatever they did because he touched him.
Yeah.
It makes it a little
Yeah.
different.
When they made that baby other and never ever mentioned it ever again.
Well, I could see that as just kind of a dramatic revelation.
Yeah.
But in terms of the others have to have a breeding cycle as well. We've been talking about the breeding cycles for dragons; they would have to have them as well. But yeah. So, anything else? I think we still got a couple minutes left. I don't want to go and steal. Gentlemen, sorry.
What would you name your dragon, Jim?
What would I name my dragon? Actually, I would probably give it a good Valyrian name, so lots of V's and Y's and X's. Unfortunately, I haven't actually developed any dragon names. People would always ask me to develop names for Valyrian steel, Valyrian steel swords. The Valyrian steel sword that I think I used Grim Malice. I think was my name. And then I named the Manderly one was Devotion.
Molten pile of slag full of ghosts is awesome. You can use that for anything. You said that earlier. It's so metal.
By all means use it. I'm a writer. I know some other people are writers here. If there's something that I have that gives you inspiration, I know I've had to look for inspiration hard enough, so use it and enjoy it.
This is like a long question. I wish I thought of this earlier, but I don't know if you have a brief answer, or if you've answered it before. Why do you think the Valyrian steel is effective against the others? That's in the books too, right?
What do we think?
So I think there's some things. They call it dragon steel, which it perhaps has a supernatural element of fire or magic instead put into it, built through blood, the fire of life. That's why I think there's blood magic involved in Valyrian steel. And so this aspect of supernatural fire against supernatural ice, I think is that. But it's definitely magic in that capacity. I don't believe dragons are actually involved in the forging of Valyrian steel. I think it's actually more of a blood magic ritual. But I think that's probably why is the kind of the antipode supernatural fire against supernatural ice. Again, being the fire of life as opposed to
Eyes of death.
I'd say, on that theory, dragon glass could potentially be used in the forging of Valyrian steel.
So I don't know if that's
The
the
fires
case
of the
though,
earth.
because so obsidian's a volcanic glass, and that typically doesn't alloy well with metal.
Yeah.
Silicone.
But at the same time, the dragon glass candles are lit using blood.
Maybe it's not Valyrian steel at all. Maybe
No.
it's obsidian. Maybe that's what
So
it is.
if you take the glass candles, which could be dragon glass candles, and then are able to somehow forge that in with iron, making a sort of steel, then blood igniting the candle within the fire.
If you find me somewhere in this panel, allow me to tell you my theory on Lightbringer being a Valyrian bronze blade. So I actually think that the process of Valyrian steel is actually within the magic of the forging itself, which imbues the specific metal with properties. And steel being a better metal makes a better blade. Like if you were to take the original Valyrian bronze Lightbringer and a Valyrian steel sword, no one would ever pick the Valyrian bronze blade because it would be heavier, smaller, and the Valyrian steel would just be much better. But I do believe that the Valyrian bronze might actually still have these more supernatural properties, like other killing capabilities.
Well, the Royces have bronze armor with
Yes.
runes that supposedly protected against them as well.
Yep. And I do think that there might even be protective magics. We know that there's Valyrian steel armor. So it's entirely
Supposedly.
Now we see your arm, we see.
No, he just says he has it. He might
But
be
now,
bullshitting.
now he might be, but I think from a thematic perspective, I think it makes more sense for it to actually have it to truly show how insane and daring you're. Because you're on. I mean, he straight up. I mean, you can't fault the guy for the ambition. Very few people actually want to kill the gods.
Yeah.
So I mean, Deicide is really as high as it gets when it comes to ambition.
Yeah, he's not crafty.
Or he never wins, and it's like tin painted with, whatever, and that would also be very
No. All right, but I've got, we're at 7:50, and so that theoretically the panel's at an end. I want to make sure that I don't hurt anybody as the next panel is coming over. But I am here, and I love to talk about crazy stuff like this. So find me offline, wherever I'm in, and just, as you can see, I love to talk, so I can chat your ear off.
Yes, we do this all week.
I missed your intro.
Oh, sorry, I'm Jim from Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire.
Okay.